Hi everybody, my name's Meena Kumari and I'm from H.O.P.E Training and Consultancy, and today I will be covering a workshop looking at forced marriages as part of the domestic abuse It's Everybody's Business. So just a little bit about myself. I am the founder of a training and consultancy company which was founded in 2008. And I deliver national training around safeguarding, domestic abuse, sexual violence and sexual abuse. I've worked within the violence against women and girls sector since 2005, and I have overseen a number of domestic abuse services, including a helpline, IDFA outreach, hostel, refuge accommodation. I've also delivered group work, predominantly within the Freedom Programme and the Recovery Toolkit, and delivered and worked with those who have used abusive behaviours within their own relationship. I have currently, during COVID, been working around the H.O.P.E Digital Art Project, and this is where I showcase Black and brown women who all work within the domestic abuse or sexual violence space, where they are showing inspirational quotes. So what you'll see in front of your screen is an image of myself, and you will see a number of these women throughout this presentation, because a number of these women work and are activists in their own right. I've also set up the National H.O.P.E meetings, which have been looking at domestic abuse in the context of Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. And as part of that meeting, we also set up as a group and wrote a letter to the Home Secretary as part of the Hidden Harm Summit. When I'm not delivering training, I also volunteer for Netball England as an independent safeguarding panel member, and I'm currently studying a master's in leading culture change in safeguarding. So today I will be looking at and focusing on forced marriages. So the definition around forced marriages, and this has been taken from the Forced Marriage Unit's website, and they also showcase, and you can download a number of publications from their website. So when we think about forced marriages, we are looking and thinking about it's where one or both people cannot consent, or in the cases of those with learning disabilities or reduced capacities, cannot consent to marriage, and they are usually pressurized, or abuse is used against them, or they are forced into that marriage. So it's very different to an arranged marriage where we think about consent. With a forced marriage, we are thinking about a lot of the times where duress is actually also used as well. We know this is recognised in the UK as a form of domestic abuse. So if you think about the current domestic abuse definition that we have, although forced marriages, honour-based violence and FGM is in that definition, it's not a statutory definition at the moment, it does include it under the context of DA. We also know it's a form of child abuse, because you can have children who are impacted by forced marriages, and it's a serious abuse of your basic human right. So your basic human right to marry who you choose you want to marry, but also to live free from abuse. The pressure is usually put on people to marry against their will, and the way that this pressure is done can be as the following. It can be done through physical means. For example, you may have family members, or you may have kind of extended family members as well, that may use threats or physical violence or threats of sexual violence and abuse. So an example could be, you will be physically assaulted, or you will be raped or sexually assaulted if you do not do the following. You also have to think about the emotional and psychological impact, but also the emotional and psychological forms of abuse that are used against children, young people and adults that are impacted by forced marriages. So if you do not marry who we have chosen for you, what will the community think? What will your relatives feel when they are abroad? If you do not go abroad with us because your grandmother's not very well, what will the community, what will the community say? Perpetrators usually make the victims feel that they're bringing shame onto the family. Another word or another terminology, and there's a few terminologies that are used, but one that is quite common is something called izzat. So a lot of people will talk about their own izzat, and a lot of people will say that they're bringing shame onto their family. So if I do not do the following, what impact will this have on my family? What will people say? Will I be respected? Will I be ostracized from my community? That level of pressure is absolutely huge. It's huge for children, but it's also huge for adults who for years have known those family members. They love those family members, and actually a lot of the times they don't want to be abused. They just want the abuse to stop. And lastly, think about the financial and economic abuse that can be impacted. and jointly used within forced marriages. So you may have someone who tells you that my family are taking away my wages, or they're stopping me from kind of seeking work, or they're asking me or forcing me to sponsor a spouse from abroad, and I have to use my financial means to do the following. So these are all the kind of things that you need to be looking out for. So a forced marriage is very different to an arranged marriage. A forced marriage, you are really thinking about that forms of duress, that element of consent, which is not there. You may have some circumstances where individuals are telling you they have been told, you know, at the start of the week, they are due to go abroad, or they're staying in England or Wales, and they are going to be married here in this country. And they will use language like, I may be married to a stranger, I don't know who I'm married with, and I haven't had any dialogues or conversations with this person. But the pressure can also be very subtle. So the forced marriage definition can also be found on the Crown Prosecution website, and it also can be found on the Forced Marriage Unit's website. And I will go through a list of national and local services that you can utilise. So when we think about forced marriages, one of the things we need to start thinking and linking it into is, how does it link into coercive and controlling behaviour? So what I've done for you is I've broken down both parts of the definition, and this is currently within the domestic abuse definition. So when we think about controlling behaviour in the context of forced marriages, as practitioners, you really want to start thinking about and recording the range of acts that that individual is telling you. So what form of acts are being used by family members or extended family members, or by siblings, cousins? Because what we find with coercive and controlling behaviour, it's these acts that are usually designed to make that person subordinate or dependent by isolating them. So you may have some family members who are predominantly the perpetrators of forced marriages, who may isolate their children from their friends or peers, or from school, or from college, or from university. They may also isolate them from their other sources of support. So they may actually stop them from going to work. They'll also exploit their resources and capacities for their own personal gain. And this is really key for a lot of controlling behaviour, because it's about, how do I, as the perpetrator of forced marriage, deprive these individuals of any means necessary for their independence. So very early on, you may have kind of survivors telling you, I wanted to go to college, I wanted to work, or I wanted to go on to further education, but that was prevented. So that in levels of independence is almost taken away from them. And then think about how individuals, their resistance and their escape levels are completely reduced. So perpetrators of forced marriages will really limit the levels or areas around individuals around forced marriages to escape. So they may take their passports off them, they may book their airline tickets, they may actually get other family members to collude around forced marriages. And then when we think about how perpetrators regulate forced marriage victims, you have to think, what can now be used to regulate someone's everyday behaviour? So a lot of victims have told me in the past, they've been kept within the home, they're not allowed to go out, their social media has been taken off them, technology has been taken off them. But also in the other context, you may have perpetrators that will use technology as a form of regulating someone's behaviour. So think about apps that might be installed onto a young person's phone. Think about apps or devices that we actually use every day in our own home. If you wanted to use this tool as a surveillance to see what that young person or that adult is doing around kind of because you want to force them into that forced marriage, it can be very easily used. When we think about coercive behaviour, it's really thinking about the act or pattern of acts that leads to the assault, or that is the assault, threats, humiliation and intimidation. So a lot of forced marriage victims will say to us, actually, I have been assaulted, or the threat of the assault is there. The humiliation acts are there, or I'm intimidated by my family members. I'm intimidated by those perpetrators that really want to force me to marry someone I just don't want to marry. And it's that abuse that is usually used to harm, punish, or frighten their victim. So in some cases, you may have some people telling you, actually, physical violence is very limited, has been limitedly used, but actually it's the fear that's instilled into forced marriage victims that is usually used to actually force them to say, or force them not to report. They might get told, actually, if you go and report to the police, who is going to believe you? If you go and report to a charity that works with victims of crime, who is going to believe you? They will use terminology like they may not understand your culture. They may say stuff like this is part of our religion. And actually a lot of this is used as a form of fear factoring, but also a form of punishment. So if the forced marriage victim doesn't agree to the marriage, there may be forms of physical, psychological, sexual, as well as financial abuse that is being used. So please, when thinking about forced marriages, always think about your definition, but linking it back to that controlling behaviour and also that coercive behaviour that perpetrators are now using. So in the UK, we do have the Forced Marriage Unit that has been collecting data for a number of years. So for the last kind of financial year end, I've captured some of the data for you as part of this presentation. So in 2009, the Forced Marriage Unit gave advice to 1,355 cases. The forced marriage is not a problem in a specific country or a culture. So as you can see, the Forced Marriage Unit since 2011 have handled cases from Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and North America. The majority of the cases that are reported to them were actually reported by education, social services, legal, and health sectors. However, that's not to say that victims themselves are not reporting or self-referring. Of the cases that the Forced Marriage Unit dealt with in 2009, 27% involved those below the age of 18. 27%, you know, we are dealing with children who are being impacted, while 36% involved those between the ages of 18 and 25. 10% also involved those with a learning disability. So please do not forget that this can impact anyone, including those with learning disabilities. The majority of the cases that are going to the Forced Marriage Unit are of female victims. However, 19% of the cases in 2019 were that of male victims around forced marriages. So again, just as I've emphasized before, do not forget those who may have learning or physical disabilities, but please don't assume just because you're a man, you cannot be impacted by a forced marriage. And actually what the data is showing from the Forced Marriage Unit year on year is the numbers around male and females and male victims in particular is also increasing. So just be mindful of that when you're thinking about risk assessments and you are taking disclosures. One of the other things that the Forced Marriage Unit looks at is something called focus countries. So in 2019, they actually handled cases relating to 66 focus countries, 7 focus countries with the highest number of cases I've actually pulled out for you on this slide. So as you can see, Pakistan as a country had the highest level of cases where the Forced Marriage Unit were engaged with. And then it was Bangladesh, then it was India, then Afghanistan, then Somalia, Iraq, and then Romania. Just reflect and think about the communities that you work with in your local area. If you are dealing with certain communities that are practicing forced marriages or are using forced marriages as a form of abuse, be mindful and be aware, link in with other services, link in with services that can work with you with these communities, because one of the key things is also educating people that forced marriages is illegal, it is an offence, and it is a form of abuse of someone's basic human rights as well. And also be mindful that, you know, at the moment during COVID, we've seen real restrictions on leaving the UK and flights going out. But actually after COVID and after lockdown, we don't know what we're going to see with regards to rates of forced marriages. So just be mindful of what awareness pieces are you doing with people in your local community? Do you understand the breakdown of your local community? Because what the Forced Marriage Unit does for us every year is break down what focus countries are. We have a national service in the UK called Karma Nirvana, who are absolutely brilliant and have been delivering services around honour-based abuse and forced marriages. They also run the national helpline. So in July 2020, they released an infographic looking at the number of calls they received in the last 12 months. So as you can see, they had just over 12,000 calls and 70% were victim support related. You can see that the majority of the individuals they are supporting were migrant women and 47 were also migrant men. 600 had children that were impacted by honour-based abuse, and as you can see, 25% had no recourse to public funds, so they were unable to apply for any form of public funds here in the UK. So Natasha Ratu is the current CEO of Karma Nirvana, and she's also part of the Digital Art Project. And what I'm able to do here is just pull out some more data that they've looked at during lockdown. So what Natasha has said nationally on some of the calls that I've been on also is that they've received just over 300% increase in receiving calls during lockdown, and over just 347% increase in receiving emails. So the breakdown of their cases has actually shown they have had a huge increase during lockdown, but also 350 of the victims that they worked with were threatened with forced marriages, and they saw an 83% increase in forced marriage protection orders, which I'm going to cover for you a bit later on. So Safe Lives are a national charity who do a lot of work in raising awareness, but also delivering training and support around domestic abuse. And one of the things they do on their website, which you can go on and have a look, is something called Spotlights. And the fourth spotlight that they did covered honour-based violence and forced marriages. And I really just want to bring your attention to some of the data that they collected from their insights data, which a number of domestic abuse services will complete once an individual has entered or exited their service. So what they discovered was, before accessing support, victims at risk of honour-based abuse experienced abuse for 2 years longer than those who didn't identify as those as honour-based violence. And honour-based violence and forced marriages sometimes can almost work hand in hand as well. Nearly a quarter, so 23% of their victims of HPV were not eligible for most benefits, and 68% of those victims were classified as high risk or serious harm of homicide. So again, just be mindful of the links to the potential links to be killed or harmed, or for that homicide to actually occur. So just remember, when we think about forced marriages, if someone is declining that forced marriage, they could potentially be a higher risk of honour-based abuse or honour-based violence. Your professional judgment, as well as your professional curiosity in the context of safeguarding, is really important in trying to understand which services you can link in, which risk assessments may need to be completed, but also there may be certain circumstances where you will need to link in with agencies like the police or children's social care or adult social care, and think about what powers may need to be used kind of really early on and quite quickly. So what are some of the reasons behind forced marriages? You know, why are perpetrators, why are families actually conducting these forced marriages? So when we think about controlling unwanted behaviour, what we've seen over the years is that notion of, actually, is this behaviour too westernised for this community or for this family? So if you are not allowed to come, you're not allowed, to smoke or to drink or to practice sex before marriage, and suddenly you've been found out that you've been doing the following, that could potentially link or lead on to a forced marriage. And it's the same with controlling unwanted sexuality. If you come home and your parents discover that actually you are in a same-sex relationship, or someone, you know, outs you and says to that family or says to the community, actually your daughter or your son are actually in a gay relationship, in a lesbian relationship, and your family or community don't know, that could be an actually indication to, actually, I'm now going to get you married, because that will either cure your sexuality or it will stop you from doing the following that we don't agree with. It's the same with preventing unwanted relationships. So you may have some people that will force their children or young person or the adults to marry because they want to prevent any unwanted relationships. Now that could even be kind of outside your own caste as well as religious groups. So you could be South Asian, you could be a Hindu like me, but you may not want, you know, if it was me, for an example, it may be, we don't want our daughter marrying someone from a different caste. It can be something like that that could trigger the forced marriage. Protecting the family honour. So this is about the honour, this is about the izzat of our family. So in order to protect that, we are going to force, you know, that young person to marry. Strengthening family links. So you will have some occasions where some families may marry their children into their own families. So thinking about strengthening family links, not just here in the UK, but also abroad. And also there will be circumstances where the marriage has only been conducted to obtain immigration advantages, so assisting claims for UK citizenship. So you may be coming across those that are reluctant spouses. So they're being forced to marry someone from abroad, and they are being forced to sponsor someone who they don't want to sponsor. You may have some families that will say, actually, we were responding to peer group or family pressure. So it's not just the peer group or family pressure here in the UK, but it also may be abroad. And then protecting perceived cultural ideas and religious ideas, which are often misguided. You know, there is no religion out there that is saying to you that you should instill this level of harm, this level of fear, this level of forms of kind of violence and abuse on children and young people because of marriage. So it's often these ideas are really misguided, and a lot of it is kind of perceived within certain communities or cultures. But the reality is a lot of people will be doing this as a form of control and a form of power that they hold. So it's always thinking about, how do I link this back to that controlling and coercive behavior? In some circumstances, and the Forced Marriage Unit have talked about this in some of their publications, there's also a really great charity that's done some work called the Anne Craft Trust, when we're thinking about ensuring care for a child or an adult with special needs. So actually, I'm now going to get someone married off because I want a carer in the home for another individual. Dowry, land and property access, if we think about dowry, so the dowry is usually given from the bride's side to the groom's side, and then in some circumstances it will be from the male side to the female side. But if dowry is going to be given and a substantial amount is kind of agreed beforehand, and it's more of that financial gain, that financial exchange, that could trigger that forced marriage as well. And lastly, unfortunately, I've had some women say to me, actually, a male child has been preferred over a female child. And because I'm not having, you know, a female child, my partner is now going to be forcibly kind of gained to marry someone else, so that that next lady or that next woman could go on to have a male child. So these are some of the reasons that's been given behind forced marriages. You may come across some others as well, and just be mindful that recording and having a dialogue, having a conversation, building that rapport, expressing empathy is really, really key. And also linking in with your specialist national and local services, which I will go through a bit later on, because there are a number of services that can support you if you are kind of key working or working with those that may be experiencing some of these aspects. So when we are working around cases around forced marriages, you know, some of the things I always ask practitioners to stop and think about is the following. So what is the intent? So we've discussed the definition around forced marriages is very different to an arranged marriage. So if the intent is around forcing that young person or child to be married against that will, there's that element of power and control, and there's that element of coercive and controlling behavior. The next thing is really to start thinking about, well, what are the rules and what are the dynamics in that household or with your family? And if the rules are you're not allowed to go out, you're not allowed to engage with others, you have to marry who we've chosen for you, you then have to start thinking about how those rules are then ingrained into that individual. And what we will then find is that element of fear. So when victims start talking to us about fear, we then find that they will talk to us about what punishments or what are the consequences if they don't do what the family are asking them to do, which will then lead you or may lead you on to complete a DASH. So your domestic abuse, stalking, honor-based violence kind of checklist will really help you to think about those questions, but also be mindful that your professional judgment is really, really key, as is your professional curiosity. If you are not aware of what a DASH is, or if you've not used one before, please go onto the Safe Lives website and have a look at the DASH toolkit. There are also some notes attached to how they can be completed. It will give you an indication of kind of whether that individual does need to go to a MARAC, a multi-agency risk assessment conference, but think about the additional honor-based violence questions on that DASH as well. The other thing that you need to be mindful of is you may have some individuals who will leave the family home and they may go to refuge or hostel or supported accommodation, or they may move out and go into rented accommodation. So you may have some individuals who may talk to you about stalking and harassment. So you might have some victims who have said no to the forced marriage, they've fled the family home, or the forced marriage may have been conducted and they've then left, and they may then start talking to you about the family or the multiple perpetrators that may be stalking them or harassing them. So be mindful of what they are telling you. Think about, are there any stalking units that are attached to the police? Are there any local services that you can speak to? There are national stalking providers that you can speak to. Paladin is a prime example. Multiple perpetrators. What we do know about forced marriage cases is you will be dealing with multiple perpetrators, both men and women. So just be mindful of kind of who you are engaging with and who you are working with. And that community collusion, you will have some perpetrators who will try and collude and manipulate services as well as others. So again, be mindful of who you're sharing information with, because you may have some young people who may go missing or run away from home because they might have been subjected to a forced marriage. So just think about what people are telling you when they're asking you for information. Technology, we talked about a bit earlier on. So just be mindful of kind of what apps do individuals have on their phones? Are they talking to you about tracking devices? Are they talking to you about if they feel unsafe? They think that the perpetrators know where they are all the time. Are they being followed? Are they being watched? Are they using CCTV cameras inside the home as well as outside the home? Anything like that, please make a note of. Please just think about the impact that this has on victims. Mediation and the one chance rule is something that Carmen and Ivana have been talking about for a number of years. So mediation is a big no-no. You would never mediate in forced marriage cases. And it's the same with one chance rule. When someone is giving you that information, please believe them. Please just think, actually, is this my one chance to have this alone time to speak to this individual about what they are experiencing? Think about who your local and national providers are. Can you link them in with an IDFA, with an outreach service? Just think about what the victims are telling you. Do not underestimate that one chance rule. And lastly, safety planning. You know, what is the most safest thing for this individual right now? Is it around calling the police? Is it speaking to the police? Is it about speaking to children's social care? Is it outreach IDFAs? You know, that risk assessment is really going to help you lead and support these victims when it comes to their own safety planning as well. What victims of forced marriages have told me over the years is the following, is they feel like sometimes it's kind of normal. So they normalize the behavior, it's normal for their community or culture. So really challenging the stereotypes is really, really key. Victims will also talk to me about victim blaming. So they will blame themselves if they don't make that decision to leave that family home, or if they don't make that decision to prosecute or go down that prosecution route for their family. But just remember, it's really hard for a young person to actually experience that. Social attitudes, just some of the attitudes or responses that they receive from other people. Just being mindful that, you know, when we think about those focus countries, you don't have to be from that particular community or culture to show a level of empathy or understanding. And mistrust, some service users have spoken to me about mistrusting some of the services that they've worked with, because sometimes the information has been disclosed that they believed was not supposed to be disclosed, or they felt like something was going to happen, an outcome was going to happen, someone was going to get arrested, and actually it didn't happen, or someone didn't get back to them. So just be mindful of all of this. And then the middle part of the bubbles, think about that intergenerational and complex trauma that a lot of these individuals will experience and are experiencing. Just be mindful that they will have experiences where services have failed to respond appropriately because they're in their own fear of being perceived as being racist. A lot of victims will have that internalization of self-blame and that honor, so that honor really stays with them. And there are services that don't have that level of awareness. So thinking about that cultural ignorance, and actually how can you become more culturally competent in understanding who your clients are and who you're working with. And lastly, around immigration and no recourse to public funds, maybe one of the biggest reasons why a lot of service users or victims will stay in a forced marriage and potentially are abused, because of that fear that they don't want to be deported. Here you just have a few images that Carmen and Ivana released this year around myths around forced marriages. So forced marriages is very different to an arranged marriage, and honor-based abuse is a culture thing. We definitely know it's not, and it's never acceptable. And you can see a number of these on their website. So there is something called the Honour Abuse Research Matrix, which was set up by someone called Dr. Roxanne Khan. And what this does is it gives you a breakdown of a number of research papers around honour-based abuse. And any of you watching this can also sign up to the network. And Dr. Khan was also part of the Digital Art Project and has been releasing some really good publications. The most recent one that she did during lockdown was around harmful traditional practices within the workforce and those who may have employees that are experiencing it. I'm just going to now show you a 6-minute clip around Paisley. Now, Paisley is a survivor of a child marriage. She's also a survivor of honour-based abuse. She's also the sister of Banaz Mahmood, and she's been part of the Digital Art Project. So I'm just going to show you 6 minutes of her clip of her lived experience and her key messages.
Many of you will be familiar with how child marriage affects thousands of girls around the world. But how many of you are aware that this is happening to girls like me right here in the UK? I was married at the age of 16. I was able to leave my child marriage, but my sister Banaz had her life stolen by so-called honour killing. It all started with a shared traumatic experience. We found ourselves in child marriage that neither of us chose or wanted. In my family, there are 5 girls and 1 boy. And when my sisters and I were between the ages of 7 to 10, we each had to undergo FGM. We were told this was done to protect us from being promiscuous and to prevent us from dishonoring our family name. This notion of honor was introduced to us at a very young age. And growing up in the UK as Iraqi immigrants, balancing 2 very different cultures was at times difficult, in particular for one of my sisters, Bakel. When she was a teenager, she started to challenge my father on his beliefs, and their relationship broke down. She ran away a couple of times, and eventually social services got involved, and she was taken into care. But of all the social workers who came into our home, not one of them asked me if I was safe. After Bakel left, every trace of her disappeared overnight, as though she never existed. And the community reacted. They cast my family out, and they threatened to throw petrol bombs at our house. My father had lost his status in the community. So in a desperate attempt to regain this, when I was 15 and studying for my GCSEs, my father came to me and he started to talk about marriage. I laughed it off because I thought he was joking, and I didn't really understand the concept of marriage. But from that moment, my father changed. He became very cold towards me, and I felt like he didn't love me anymore. And so a couple of months later, when my sister Banaz was just 17, she had a child marriage to a man much older than her who she didn't know. Banaz dropped out of college, and she moved to Birmingham with her new husband. So I hardly saw of her. But when I did see her, I noticed she became low and she became quiet. She changed as a person. Then when I was 16, the conversation of marriage came up again. This time, my father said, "There's another man who wants to marry you." And being unaware of the consequences, being scared to say no again, I said to my father, "Do what makes you happy." And then it all happened so quickly. One day I was called to the living room by my father. He told me to sit down, pay my respects, and don't speak. I didn't really know how to behave because all my life my family had said, "Don't talk to boys and don't look at boys." Yet all of a sudden, they said, "Here is your husband." So I sat there listening to my father, my mother, and this man. They were just talking about me as though I was an item at an auction sale. I did as I was told, but for just a brief moment, I looked up and the first thing I noticed was that he was so old. He was losing his hair, and I remember thinking, God, he looks like an uncle. Now, I was supposed to have dressed up and really made an effort to meet my husband. But I thought to myself, maybe if I don't, he'll see me and he'll think, I don't want her. But it was too late. The deal had been done, and I was just given away to this man. So the wedding arrangement started, and we went shopping for jewelry and the wedding dress. And every shop that we walked into, my mother showed me expensive gold bangles and necklaces. But I wasn't into any of that. I was a teenager growing up in London, and I loved pop fashion. I looked up to the likes of Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera. But of course, a big, frilly, covered up to the neck wedding dress and kitten heels were chosen for me. I found it so disgusting. I still do. So in the wedding shops, I tried to act like a brat to show that I was a child. And I just wanted to complete my childhood, really, and focus on my education. But I knew deep down there was nothing I could do to stop this. And none of the shopkeepers questioned my age or said anything about how young I looked. When I look back now, I realize that instead of saying, I don't want to get married, I just kept trying to show that I wasn't going to be good at it. In the religious part of the ceremony, the imam didn't question my age, and he conducted the whole ceremony in Arabic. I was the only one who didn't speak Arabic, yet nobody told me what it all meant.
So thank you for watching the clip around Paisley. I hope you found it useful. Please, in your own time, if you do want to watch the rest of that TEDx talk, please do. And just be mindful that, you know, Paisley is an amazing activist and has been doing so much work in trying to raise awareness around child marriage and forced marriage, and just really listen to what her key messages were. She was so young when this happened to her, and think about, you know, and also think about what Banaz, her own sister, experienced as well. To just be mindful that there are still, you know, victims as well as survivors out there that are experiencing everything that we've been talking about today so far. The last few slides, I just want to introduce you to a few more kind of publications. So Dr. Mohammed Mazir Idris, who's a senior lecturer, talks about forced marriages in the context of how it impacts male victims of forced marriages. So you can look at a lot of the work that he's done. And one of the publications that I do recommend is Men, Masculinities and Honor-Based Abuse. So a lot of his work is around forced marriages and honor-based abuse. So we do have forced marriage protection orders here that you can access, and they have been around since 2007. So it's just being mindful and remembering that forced marriage protection orders can both prevent the forced marriage from occurring, but also protect those who have been forced into the marriage. You can apply for the order either within or outside of England and Wales, and the order can include prohibitions, restrictions, or requirements. They can last for a specific period of time or can be for an indefinite period of time as well. We also have legislation around forced marriages, which was updated in 2014. And this gives you an overview that actually taking someone overseas and forcing them to marrying someone who lacks the mental capacity, breaching a forced marriage protection order, the civil remedy of obtaining a forced marriage protection order can still be kind of gained through the family courts, and that will continue to exist alongside the new criminal offence, so victims can choose how they wish to be assisted. And that's really key, is giving the victim the choice and having that dialogue with them. We have had some convictions around forced marriages, and you'll be able to see that kind of online. National and local services. What I've done is I've listed a few national and local services that have been working around forced marriages for a number of years. So a number of these services you can type into kind of Google and have a bit of a search where they are, and they're all kind of based kind of nationally. They are doing some amazing work, and they've been doing some amazing work during lockdown as well, because we pretty much saw overnight that a lot of these local kind of grassroots organisations and national organisations had to change how they worked around forced marriages really, really quickly, and around honour-based abuse and around domestic abuse. So please have a look at what some of these services do when you can in your own time. I just want to end by saying thank you so much for listening to the presentation. I always say to individuals, there is always hope, and I really hope you kind of have enjoyed what we've talked about today, what I've covered, and take care, look after yourselves. I'll speak to you soon.